I'm sitting in a Buddhist temple in Ho Chi Minh City, wearing a periwinkle robe. It's so large, it masks any indication that I have a shape underneath. The locals are wearing matching attire. I'm in this expansive room with only 3 walls and a high ceiling. The 4th one is completely open to the outside. Earthy incense perfume the room. At the front sits a giant golden Buddha, stoically taking up a quarter of the space. It's surrounded by strands of marigold, chrysanthemums, baskets of citrus. For a religion that's based off of simplicity, this is certainly ostentatious. I'm the only blonde person in a sea of 200 black-haired people. Some of them turn back and look at me, and then whisper to each other. Those that feel more confident with their English approach me. "Hi, I'm Ko Aung," he says quickly, or maybe slowly. I have no idea. I struggle to say hello and make my tongue and mouth mimic what I just heard and try to agree with each other, but just some noise comes out of my mouth, like as if I was a toddler trying to speak Vietnamese. Probably worse, to be honest. I just smile awkwardly instead. He laughs at this silly white girl. She's trying. That's cute. And he says, "Well, what's your name?" "Adrian," I say. And he looks at me bemused, like he couldn't possibly make those same noises. Like it was a foreign tongue to him. "You can just call me A," I say. "A," he says with a diphthong and continues to bend this singular vowel with the phonology of his mother tongue. "Have you ever meditated before?" Thinking, surely this white girl doesn't have the mental fortitude to do what we do. I explained to him that I've actually been meditating for 10 years, but he kind of disregards it and continues to instruct me. It's fine. I would rather hear how they do it and follow his lead. I am in his country. A bell rings and the room starts to organize itself. Everyone breaks up from their whispered conversations and finds a nearby seat. I sit on a lavender pillow and try to sit up straight. My knees are inches away from my neighbor's folded legs. I feel the slight body heat radiate from them, even though it's so humid in Ho Chi Minh City. I close my eyes. Then the chanting begins. The leader at the front starts to hum. Bells ring. More incense are lit. I inhale. We stand. Chant. We sit. Chant. My friendly neighbor is constantly side-eyeing me, guiding when to sit down, when to kneel, and don't put my book on the floor because that is sacrosanct. It's like having the American flag touch the ground. The room of 200 people begins to croon and chant in unison, and my feelings about Asia begin to settle like dust. I had been traveling so fast throughout Thailand and Vietnam for the past few weeks. Next stop, Singapore. I rarely had time to pause and think. This was my first time in Asia, and although I was an experienced traveler, this side of the planet was endlessly perplexing to me. It was twisting everything I knew about the world. Hell, Asia is its own world. Everything was different. The goose honking of tuk-tuks, the fishy smells, the speed of motorbikes, the toilets, how sidewalks were often turned into streets or outdoor restaurants, the heat, and the flowers. They even rested their bodies differently, perched low to the ground like a bird balancing on an electric wire. My mind was imploding on how this world worked. I mean, I had traveled significantly before, but in comparison, Europe and Asia seemed so much more familiar. Asia was like walking through a Twilight Zone episode. But what was most eye-opening to me was how frustrated I felt. Maybe it was the humidity or the fact that just crossing the street was a new game, with all the motorbikes buzzing past me. Sometimes I felt like I needed a helmet to get to the other side. And I started to notice how attached I was to how things happened in the West. I mean, I knew it was going to be different, but Asia was stripping me from everything I knew to be familiar and expected me to still dance to it. I didn't get it. It was like I was trying to complete a puzzle, saw the box, but was missing most of the centerpieces. And I noticed some of my sour knee-jerk reactions when I experienced something new. I would mindlessly say, "That's so weird," when a local would explain a custom to me. And after a few times, I realized how insensitive that was. It wasn't weird to them. That was their normal. I was the weirdo. As I sat and began to hear the hums and concordant breaths in the room, I started to separate myself from my way of life, practice letting go of my worldview. But I think my largest struggle at that point was the language barrier. It seemed larger than the Great Wall of China. I thrive off of talking to locals and strangers. You are listening to the result of that passion. I don't know what I would give up in order to speak effortlessly to anyone in the world, but you can make me an offer. Nothing enriches my travels like chats with vendors, baristas, and taxi cab drivers. It gives me a sense of connection I need as a human. I want to be able to make everyone smile in a different country, even if they're laughing at this wacky white woman. Wherever I go, I always try to learn bits and pieces of the language. Hello, thank you, cool, do you speak English? Which I can say in 5 languages. And I feel like I learn them relatively quickly because I really want to learn them. But in Asia, I felt cut off from that lifeline. But these Asian languages were impossible. I would listen hard to the locals and try to curl my tongue and mouth to match the same sounds that they were making. And I tried so hard. All I wanted to do was say hello, and it just sounded like I was speaking with water in my mouth. Most days I realized I hadn't actually spoken to anyone. I would have a million conversations, but only with myself. Why couldn't I get these damn languages? I was so annoyed at this invisible border. I inhale a breath of citrus and incense and listen to the locals chant around me. They make noises that I could never make with my own mouth. In a moment, I'm astonished by the variety of noises that humans can make, and I'm curious as to why their language and English sound so different. Both are an amalgamation of sounds that are structured to convey meaning, but their vibrations have no significance to me. Only noise. It was my ego that was confused, frustrated, tenaciously stuck in its idea of how the world sounds. It was causing its own suffering with my attachment to a limited perspective, as if my lifestyle was the only valid one. I inhaled another breath, deeper this time, down into my diaphragm, and tried to chip away at my ego. Tried to envision my life on this side of the planet. How would I see the globe, humans, or my purpose differently? I began to submit to my ignorance. Travel often eradicates our egos in different ways, through meditation, drugs, walking, being in nature. But how can we be honest about our growth without all of the eat, pray, love judgments? On today's episode, we're humbled. We will talk to travelers who feel deep spiritual shifts as they explore our tangible planet. We will talk to travelers who have had consciousness risings, shed old versions of themselves, and reached for a truer, higher self. I'm Adrienne Bain, and this is Strangers Abroad. Here we go. Some of us use travel as a way to escape the growth we are desperately in need of. Home can be too triggering, too tempting, too provoking. Maybe my fears, anxieties, and pains will stay overseas if I fly far away from it. That's what Richard Cardillo, a New York City storyteller, believed when he got dispatched on a missionary expedition to Peru. Most of us were raised with a clear spiritual path. Organized religion has dominated our collective spiritual journeys, but they've also dictated what is and isn't acceptable. Richard always knew he was gay, but threw himself into the organization that vocally denied his true self, and he did believe that the monastic life was the right path.
So if I go back to the beginning of this story, When I was 16 years old, I knew damn well that I was gay, but I was from such a really, really religious family, so super Catholic. I had 8 brothers and sisters, so it was this large family of 9, and I knew that there was something wrong with me, and that's all I could think of. There was something wrong that I might grow out of. I had no gay role models. This was when I graduated. I graduated high school in 1976, and I knew that I had to fake it till I could make it as a straight man. In my heart of hearts, though, I knew that I could never marry a woman and have children, even though I had a desire to have children, but I just thought that was an impossibility. You could never do it because you were a gay man. So I said, I'll give that up, and I cannot marry a woman. But if I stayed single for too long, it would kind of show what that meant, that I was a gay man. So I went the next best route and decided to join a monastery. I joke about that with lines, that at the age of 16, I made this profound decision to give my life to Jesus. Because doesn't every 16-year-old know what they want to do with their penis for the rest of their lives? I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking, that I could just hide it and repress it all. And I did for many years. People usually ask me, weren't you jerking off? So the answer to both those questions was yes. And the answer to both those questions was a lot. So, yes, I mean, but that was all. I don't even know what I fantasized about at the time, to tell you the truth. I had never, experienced the flesh of another person. So I didn't really know, what I was masturbating to. I didn't know what pornography was at the time. I mean, I knew what it was, but it just never was something that I would pursue. So there was nothing involved with that. More of the time, it was up until my mid-20s, having the feeling most adolescent boys talk about when they first start, with their experiences of masturbation as early kids, this sense of guilt that came over them for doing this thing that was probably so wrong and so dirty, and this feeling of guilt. And that stayed with me until my mid-20s, and probably was the single largest reason for spending thousands in therapy later on in my life to get the fuck over that. Once I made the decision to join, I threw myself in to the point where, I want to be honest. I was convinced that Jesus was the answer, that I could give my life to others. 2 things that came from that. Number one is I believed it 100%, and I lived it 100% and felt good about it 88 to 89%. I felt that. But number 2, I knew that the things I was learning was valuable, whether they were spiritual, about human life, about human nature. I knew that my life was changing as a result of the way that I was living it. And I do have to say this, as much as I make fun of religious life, and I don't think it's a cool life for many people, although I lived with some people that, celibacy and living a vowed life is exactly where they should have been. And that was, their calling in life. I don't know if it was a calling for me. It was more of an escape. However, I had the luxury of not getting involved with relationships so that I could be of more service to others. So there was kind of this wall. And it's funny, when you take the vow of poverty, they say when you don't get a paycheck on your own, you could be more rich for other people. And for the vow of obedience, they say when you listen to your superiors and go where they tell you to go, you have more free will. In some ways, that's bullshit. But with the vow of celibacy, what they say is because you're not putting so much of your energies into developing particular relationships and intimate relationships with other human beings, i.e. a man for a woman and a woman for a man, that's all that was allowed, you're more free to love others. I believe that with all my heart. I still do believe it. I think that time for me, I was doing what I should have been doing, was I knew these gay feelings weren't going away. And I was so afraid of temptation in New York that I asked my superiors to send me far away with very hard work. And that's when I was surprised when they sent me to Peru.
But when we travel, our problems don't stay at home. They zip themselves into our carry-on and travel with us. Often the problems we're trying to avoid become even more heightened and unavoidable, in spite of trying to escape them. What is being suppressed always submerges.
However, I really did grow up when I was in Peru. I was this privileged white kid who, even though went through all of this training, was not ready for what I found when I went to Peru. I was cast to working in villages and towns that were the poorest of the poor. People used to call Lima in the 80s the Calcutta of Latin America. It was just so bad. There was hyperinflation, so money meant nothing. People only bartered there. There was no sanitation for anybody in practically the entire city. Only 1 out of every 8 people had running water in their homes. Crime was rampant. And the worst of it all is there was a terrorist group who were strict Maoists who were determined to overthrow the government. They went by the name the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso. So one of my roles was to protect the people who were escaping from the provinces where Sendero Luminoso was at their worst. So I found myself working amongst these people, and I was cast in the role by them of almost like a savior. I would walk into some of these villages, and the first thing old ladies would do would be kiss my hands. And I would want to say to them, dears, you don't know what I'm doing with these hands at night. You should not be kissing them at all. And I felt shame in many different ways. However, I really learned about community, camaraderie. I don't know how much of it had a religious or spiritual bent. It was always in that guise. But for me, I did find God amongst the people. I found my spirituality from looking at how these people were survivors. One little vignette that I do remember is one of my first days in my new village of working. One family who I was going to be staying with asked me to have a dinner in my honor with the rest of the village. And they were dirt poor. I mean, they had soup every night and that's it. She would make her own little tortillas every morning, but nothing else for this family. They made such a feast with chicken and lamb they had for us that day. And one of the delicacies for them was to make this real strong soup called a caldo, C-A-L-D-O. And inside that caldo, for the guest of honor, they put the claw of the chicken to flavor it. And the guest would take the claw out and suck out the marrow from the claw. And I looked at it and I just couldn't do it. I didn't know at the time that I was insulting them by doing that. They had probably killed their only chicken for me. So that was an idea of how giving these people were. I eventually made the decision that this just was not working for me. And it was going to pain me to leave the work with these wonderful people. I had learned so much about myself, but I knew I was living a double life. I had finally accepted inside myself that I was gay. And while I was celibate, I mean, I have no reason to lie about it now. I was celibate for up to that point, practically 14 years. I was 28 years old.
Although Richard came to Peru to avoid his issues, he ended up expediting them instead. He realized that although he had missed out on some major sexual and romantic experiences, it might have saved his life.
But my travel on foreign soil, my walking the ground of another culture, expedited everything. And when I think of the contrasts that were there, I was in a country that was just so downtrodden, in addition to being so macho and so repressed. I mean, homosexuality was still illegal in Peru when I was there. You could not be openly gay on the streets at all. So here I was trying to find out how to discover myself. And blessed hindsight, I know my travel to that country was it gave me this very special, unique perspective on what my life was going to become. After 14 years of my life, I could no longer be a religious monk. And I know that made me stronger and more fierce and fed my advocacy and my protest roots like that they would not have been fed if I didn't have those experiences. What did happen, though, was I made this decision to leave the monastery and not come back to the United States of America, where this was 1984, an openly gay life. Two things came to mind when I realized that. Number one, I was aware of it, but not super aware at the time, that I was a celibate man in the midst of a global AIDS epidemic that was killing gay men. And I know the only reason I stayed alive was because I was celibate through this epidemic. That's what kept me alive. So there was this weight of survivor guilt that stayed with me throughout this whole process.
Being celibate wasn't a waste of time. It actually might have saved his. And he's taken the lessons that he learned from those 14 years and fuels it into his teachings, his daily teachings and activism. Everyone has a different path, and he learned to accept his and respect others, which starts with listening.
When I think of the travel that I've done and the people that I've met from Peru, that set me on a path when I came back to this country to, number one, simply listen to people. Number two, accept people where they are. And that's been really important. I think what's fed my resistance to this current regime we have in our country right now with, Trump mania and all, I think what's allowed me to survive was that skill of listening. And as painful as it is to listen to a Trump supporter, the first thing that I do is find out why they're a Trump supporter before I say, you're wrong. I'll eventually get to the point of you're wrong. I know that, but I won't lead with that. And I think all of that had its roots in my life in Peru, in my travel to Peru. Have very few regrets about it right now. I mean, the biggest regret, I know, I turned 60 this year. And the biggest regret is that I didn't have more sex in my life. So I'm trying my hardest to make up for it now. So
although being in the monastery probably saved his life, Richard is now happily skipping along a new holy path of sexual awakening. Sometimes we need to shed a layer of ourselves, like snakeskin. And traveling through nature can uproot many of the habits that are implanted in our daily routine. It strips us of our normal environment, one filled with temptation, and helps us see ourselves more clearly. Many of us go out of our way to have that exposing experience, to feel the sun on our skin, dirt under our shoes. It helps us feel connected to our ancestors, the ones whose backs were bent over harvesting seeds and berries instead of over a computer. We still need that. To be surrounded by trees, push our bodies up mountains, and dive into water. These experiences are what Gail Straub has spent the past few years documenting. She has a podcast and a book called She Explores, which shares stories of women out in the wild. Nature's been a great influence for these women's sense of direction in life and on the trail. I started by asking where her relationship began with the great outdoors.
My dad grew up with a love of nature and farming and agriculture. So he wanted to live in New Hampshire, even though he was a manufacturing engineer. In his spare time, we had sheep and chickens and pigs and a full veggie garden. And we didn't have a lot of land. I think we had my parents still live in the same 200-year-old house that I grew up in, but we had 2.5 acres, but there were lots of trails going from our house because there were snowmobile trails and old, class 3 roads. And my parents gave us the freedom to kind of explore beyond our backyard. So I think my connection with nature really started before I can remember, just because of how much time we spent outside as kids and got to interact with the landscape in New Hampshire.
When Gail was older, working in an office job, she realized that her connection to nature was dwindling. Her investment in She Explores reinvigorated her love for nature, but also allowed her to connect with women who found a spiritual need to be outside. Historically, the feminine is tied to nature. We literally call it a mother. But because of the powers that women have, our ability to menstruate, give birth, and feed children, our narrative has always been intertwined with nature. We're seen to be ruled by our bodies more than our minds, thought to be messy, chaotic, unruly. And the stereotype today is a woman with long hair and a flower print skirt and top, wearing Birkenstocks and holding a crystal while walking in a stream. I asked Gail if She Explores has expanded the stories around the female experience in nature.
I think that it's, every person who I talk to is different, obviously. And that's something I'm really intentional about, trying to have a diverse range of voices in terms of like backgrounds and experience levels and, even recognizability. Like I really like featuring people who don't have like a million followers on Instagram because I don't think that matters. But I think that a commonality that I've found between the women is that they are looking for time that's their own, and they're looking to be able to hear the voice inside their head. They're looking to feel calm in nature. They're looking to like feel like themselves, like it's so easy to feel distracted in everyday life, and it can feel like you're going through the motions or that there isn't time for you. And I think that that's a common theme that I've heard from women. I think that some of the stereotype of, there's like a bit of like a trope with women in the outdoors of being healed or kind of going in with the trauma and being healed through the outdoors. And I think that's really started with, I don't know if it started with it, but I think it was perpetuated by Cheryl Strayed's Wild, which is a fantastic book and I love it. But I think that it has created a bit of a narrative that it feels like we need to be broken to go into the outdoors. And I don't think that that's true. I think that it is valid to feel that way and to find healing there. But I don't think that that's the only story that there is for women. And I've heard over, I've interviewed several women who have done long through hikes or, really immerse themselves for long periods of time in a way that kind of changes their life. But there is this return, there is a return to even if you change your life after that, like you are still yourself. And in some ways, nature can be a distraction too, if you're looking to kind of solve something or run away from something. So, there is this very real post-trail depression that can happen for people who have through hiked. And yeah, I just don't think it's good to perpetuate any narrative that's a little too fantastical or is any panacea, because it's not constructive over a long period of time.
I'd never heard of the post-trail blues, but I can assume it's something similar to reverse culture shock. After being submerged in a different culture for so long, returning home can be more startling than leaving it. I asked her to unpack this phenomenon.
I can't speak to it personally, but I've heard